The mud of the Western Front did not discriminate. It clung to the boots of every man, German and British alike, a thick, suffocating blanket drawn across the grave of Europe. This was not a war of flags and heroes, it was a war of cold, endless rain and the gnawing anxiety of the unknown. For 2 years, the trenches had been home to Corporal Johann Krieder, a Prussian boy forged in the steel of military discipline, now a man hollowed out by the sheer monotonous horror of survival. His world was the 3-foot-wide parapet, the smell of cordite and decay, and the ever-present chorus of distant lethal artillery. Hope was an abstract noun, a word learned in school, now forgotten in the stench of the Somme. But even in the blackest night, the stars still hung high above the conflict, and the human heart, no matter how deeply buried, still beat a rhythm of its own. The morning of the assault arrived not with a bang, but with a sudden, sickening silence. The all-night barrage had finally ceased, and a dense, chemical fog, the ghost of poison gas, hung low over no man's land. The order came down the line, a shouted word lost almost immediately in the damp air. Vorwärts. Forward. Johann tightened his grip on his rifle, his knuckles white, his breath frosting in the air. This was the moment of truth, the plunge into the dark. Over the top they went, scrambling from the relative safety of the trench into the churned-up wasteland. A landscape of stumps, craters, and endless looping coils of barbed wire. The silence broke. It shattered into a million pieces of sound. The crackle of machine gun fire, the screams of the wounded, the hollow thud of mortar shells hitting the viscous earth. Johann ran, a mechanical cog in the great machine of the German advance, his eyes fixed only on the immediate, lethal objective. He saw his comrades fall, one stumbling into a crater, another simply dissolving in a spray of blood and khaki. He threw himself down beside a shattered oak stump, the bark torn away like skin. His breath came in ragged gasps. He wiped the mud and sweat from his eyes, the smell of hot oil and blood filling his nostrils. And then he saw him. 50 yards away, impossibly close, a flash of enemy khaki snagged on the wicked barbs of a wire entanglement. It was a British soldier, little more than a boy, twisted in the wire like a caught bird. He wasn't moving, but his head was turned, his eyes wide and vacant, staring up at the slate-grey sky. At first, Johann felt the familiar, cold indifference of the trenches. He was just a target, an obstacle, an enemy unit. But then a sound cut through the roar of the battle, a sound so small, so utterly out of place, that it stopped Johann's world. It was a low, desperate moan, a sound stripped of all uniform, all nationality, all military pride. It was the sound of pure, searing human pain. He saw the crimson blooming on the enemy's thigh, the way the boy's fingers weakly clawed at the air, not reaching for a weapon, but for something, anything, to ease the agony. In that instant, the chasm of war narrowed to a single agonizing moral choice. On one side stood obedience, the iron law of his oath, the shouted command to kill, the threat of the firing squad for desertion or compassion. On the other stood humanity, the primal, undeniable recognition of himself in the suffering boy. The enemy's blood was just as red, his pain just as real. It was not a long internal debate, but a sudden visceral strike of conscience. A flicker of memory, a lost childhood prayer, the face of his own younger brother pierced the brutal haze of the war. He made his choice. The decision felt less like an act of defiance and more like an uncontrollable gravitational pull. Johann discarded his helmet and his pack, shedding the symbols of his duty. He took a deep, steadying breath that tasted of gunpowder and decay. And then he moved. He crawled out from the cover of the stump, not running, but a low, measured, agonizingly slow advance. The machine guns were still chattering, but they seemed distant, muted. Every inch of ground was a footstep into mortal danger. His comrades shouted. He heard Lieutenant Klaus's voice, sharp and laced with disbelief. "Krieger! What are you doing? Get back! That's an order!" Johann did not look back. He could feel the eyes of his platoon on him, eyes that held fear, bewilderment, and perhaps even a sliver of grudging admiration. He reached the wire. He was close enough now to see the terror in the British soldier's eyes, a light-haired boy whose uniform was soaked and tattered. The boy saw the German corporal not 10 feet away, and his eyes clenched shut, awaiting the coup de grâce. Instead, Johann spoke, his voice a low, urgent murmur in German, a language the boy would not understand, but whose tone held no threat. "Quiet. Hold still. I am not here to hurt you." With the precision of a field medic, a skill learned not on the training ground, but from binding the wounds of his own falling friends, Johann began the impossible extraction. The wire was a nest of metal teeth designed to hold and tear. He worked with his bare hands, the barbs ripping into his gloves, then his skin. He had to lift the boy, ease him, inch by agonizing inch, from the metal snare. A bullet whizzed past his ear, the sound like an angry hornet. They had been spotted. The firing intensified, focusing on the two men huddled in the deadly wire. Johann ignored the fire. He lifted the boy's head, placed a hand under his arm, and with a superhuman effort born of pure, desperate will, he dragged the young Englishman free. The retreat was the most breathtaking part of the ordeal. Johann could not walk. He had to crawl, pulling the limp, silent body of his enemy behind him, using the craters and the shattered earth for the briefest pockets of cover. He could hear the thud of running footsteps. Were they British counterattacking, or his own side coming to shoot him? He found a large, deep shell crater, half filled with icy, muddy water, a sanctuary the size of a grave. He pushed the boy down into the thick mud and slid in after him. The shooting raged above them, but for the moment they were hidden. Johann tore off a piece of his uniform and tightly bound the boy's bleeding leg, his breath ragged, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The British soldier opened his eyes. He looked at the German, his rescuer, with a look that transcended fear and war, a look of exhausted, profound gratitude. He whispered a single, barely audible word, a sound that needed no translation. "Thank you." Johann nodded, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. He understood the cost of this moment. He knew he had traded his duty for this silent, shared humanity. He had risked death, not in service of his country, but in service of a higher, forgotten law. He stayed there for an hour, two, until the firing shifted and the sky began to bleed into the grey twilight. When he was sure they were clear, he helped the boy limp towards the distant dark shape of the British lines, then melted back into the shadows of no man's land, disappearing as quietly as he had arrived. Corporal Johann Krieger returned to his trench under the cover of darkness. He faced the wrath of his lieutenant, the suspicion of his comrades, and the heavy burden of a court-martial that loomed, a shadow over his future. But when he stood before the inquiry, He did not offer an excuse. He simply stated the truth, the only truth that mattered. He was a man, wounded and helpless. I could not leave him to die. His punishment was severe, a stark reminder that war tolerates no acts of individual compassion. But the story did not die in the trench. It lived in the whispered awe of his fellow soldiers and in the memory of a young British man who survived the war because of the sudden, bewildering grace of his enemy. In the end, the Western Front swallowed a generation. It was a place of darkness, mud, and unimaginable suffering. Yet, in the story of Corporal Johann Krieder, we find a truth that the great guns could never silence. That even when humanity is stripped down to its most brutal primal core, when the world is nothing but barbed wire and mud, the most powerful force is not the order of a general, but the whisper of a conscience. The light of God, the undeniable call of the human soul, can shine through the darkest night of the war. And sometimes, risking everything to save your enemy is the only way to truly save yourself. Would you like to hear more stories of extraordinary compassion and defiance during the Great War?